Okay, so welcome to Brain Injury, the Silent Epidemic. My name is Martin Kerrigan. I am the chairperson of the Maryland Traumatic Brain Injury Advisory Board. And I'm also a Montgomery County Public School teacher, currently working as the transition support teacher at Northwood High School. Just a real quick background so you guys know that about me and why I consider myself to be qualified to lead the session. I have both a master's and a postgraduate degree in special education with an emphasis in acquired brain injury. I've been, like I said, the chairperson of the Traumatic Brain Injury Advisory Board, and I have presented at state and regional conferences on various things regarding brain injury in students. So, all that being said, I'm going to try and relax the Jersey in me who likes to talk a little too quickly and take it from here. Oh, by the way, at any point in time, if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat. If I don't see them when I get to the end, just ask them again. It's not personal. It's me trying to navigate technology, especially away from my office. So the objectives for today's session is that there will be a brief overview of traumatic brain injury and how it may manifest itself in students. We'll become familiar with the discrepancies in incidence versus the number of students currently identified as having a traumatic brain injury. And then we will have some suggestions on best practices for working with students with traumatic brain injuries. I can say pretty much that I am confident that most of you are probably already using a lot of these best practices with students as it is. Some of you may already be somewhat familiar with these things, but we're just going to go ahead through it. Okay, so this is not a lesson on, this is not a biology lesson on the anatomy of the brain, but for the purposes of us, I think it is important to know that there are four main lobes of the brain that really kind of control or most of our daily functioning. And there's other things too, like the brain stem and other pieces, but the four main lobes of the brain are the frontal lobe, which is the top of your head, the temporal lobe, which is on your side, and then the parietal lobe, which is kind of in the back of your head, and the occipital, which is down low. The two lobes that really impact the majority of the brain injuries that we see and deal with are the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe is pretty much what separates kids from grown-ups, and this is why there's such a thing as puberty, right? It's when that frontal lobe develops. I also like to point out that a lot of times the frontal lobe develops about 2 years sooner in females than it does males, hence middle school boys, okay? Like this is where they come from, right? It's that frontal lobe. And the temporal lobe is on the side of your head. And real quick, just because we got a little bit more time, take your fingers and do me a favor, press on your temples, okay? You should be able to feel that. Like you should be able to feel that on your brain, right? Now take it and press up on the top of your head where your frontal lobe would be. You can't really feel that, can you? Temporal lobe is considered it's the problem with the temporal lobe is it's the narrowest, thinnest bone in our skull. So this is why we're very susceptible when we get hit on the sides of our head to damage to our temporal lobe. And again, if you see that language piece in there, that's part of it, receptive language, being able to process what you're hearing, what's being told to you. I'm not going to read these all to you, you can see it. The other thing I want to point out before we go on, rarely does an injury happen in just one part of your brain. So that may be where like it's centered, but because the nature of the brain is that it moves back and forth inside your skull, or when it's shaken, it's usually multiple parts of the brain are injured. So just keep that in mind if you do come across the brain injury as we go further in this discussion. Okay, so this is just a very short list. Again, I'm used to doing this presentation over a much larger period of time, but the consequence of brain injury on cognition. Okay, so this is going to affect us because this is what we see and deal with as teachers in the classroom on a regular basis. Okay, so confusion, memory, attention, decision-making and problem solving, initiation, and task completion. So pretty much like all thinking, right? Okay, so brain injury impacts that. All right. right? Then there's also this next piece, right? The consequences of brain injury on behavior and emotion. So this is something that's really worth noting or talking about. Brain injury more and more often is being considered a behavioral health issue. Now I can tell you, initially I was kind of put off by that because I'm like, it's not a behavioral health issue, but because of this piece right here, and because of where these individuals are ending up, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of slides later, it probably is appropriate to be considered a behavioral health issue because a lot of times there's behavioral health consequences as a result of brain injury, especially untreated brain injury. So again, problems with self-control and impulsivity, self-awareness, social situations, and emotional regulation. Oh, again, I go back to that. This sounds like middle school boys, right? And early high school boys. For some of us like me, this is, if you ask my wife, this is who I still am, but it's for another day. Okay, so real quick, the overall umbrella of brain injury. So there's congenital and perinatal. Chances are you're not going to come across that. If you do, that's being served under other categories. Those are those types of brain injuries that happened usually in utero before a child was even born. Those are dealt with, usually under developmental delay. Acquired brain injury is the overall umbrella that covers all brain injuries that happen after birth, okay? What we're used to mainly hearing about are traumatic brain injuries, okay? But non-traumatic brain injuries are things like tumors, opioid overdose, which again, especially what's been going on lately, that is an important thing for us to remember, especially those of us that may be working with high schoolers, okay? Opioid overdose, because there's a lack of oxygen to the brain that can be considered a non-traumatic brain injury. However, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, traumatic brain injury is the only type of brain injury that is covered under IDEA. The other types of brain injuries will be covered under other categories. And the two types of traumatic brain injuries are open and penetrating, which would be a gunshot wound, a blast injury, something that actually goes into your skull and penetrates the skull. Then there's closed head injuries, which are sports-related, falls, shaken baby syndrome, believe it or not, is a closed traumatic brain injury that oftentimes, again, is undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. Okay, so this slide I really like because to me, these are just a couple pieces of data that really sums it up. And just real quick, full disclosure, I've been working for several years to try to get legislation introduced at the state level that would just during the screening process to have a couple questions about exploring the history of a brain injury. Again, this year passed the House of Delegates, but it never made it out of committee in the Senate. So I guess next year I'll be back in Annapolis trying to do this again. But I use this data when I present to them. So in 2017, and again, this was the last year that I was able to get hospital data from, there was about 4,800 emergency department visits and 210 hospitalizations with Marylanders ages birth through 18 with a primary diagnosis of traumatic brain injury, okay? So that's just 1 year. And this data, again, is consistent through the last 15 years. I've been looking at this data, it's been consistent. However, at the same time, the last MSDE special ed census data that came out in October of 2021, there's 111,315 students that are receiving special ed services. Only 221 are being served with a diagnosis of traumatic brain injury, okay? Now, that's 221 total ages birth through actually 21 that are being served. But if I look at the top, there was just 210 hospitalizations alone and 4,800 emergency department visits. This doesn't take into account the kids that go to their pediatricians, go to an urgent care, or are not seen at all. We're missing a huge group of kids here, hence why it's called the silent epidemic. So right now, less than 0.2% of 1% of all students with IEPs in Maryland are identified as traumatic brain injury. So if I look at this data alone, I say, well, yeah, it is a low incidence disability. Yeah, I'm sure this is serious, but there's only 221 kids. I would also go out on a limb and say that those 221 kids are the kids that we're aware of because they were in a horrible car accident, going home from a football game after homecoming or something like that, and that everybody was aware of it and that it was clear and it was known that they had a brain injury. What about all those other kids who fell or gotten, hit their head or victims of abuse or whatever it may be that were never seen by a doctor or not seen right, not seen and diagnosed properly? That's my concern, because those kids, what happens to them? So this is not just me who is passionate about this or a small group of us. The CDC has been saying for years that, and this is actually where I got the title, the silent epidemic. That came from the CDC back in the, I think that was actually even in the late 90s when they came up with the term, the silent epidemic. But in 2018, they published a report to Congress, the management of traumatic brain injury in children. It's a great report. It's actually very reader friendly. It's not too daunting. I put a link to it at the end of the presentation. So if you're interested in following up a little bit more and seeing that, I thought it was a very well done. So it is widely recognized that children with brain injuries are underidentified for health and educational services and underserved by existing supports, placing them at risk for poor health and educational outcomes. And in that, I would also say societal outcomes. The report also states that the inability to access available educational services includes the potential underidentification of students with brain injury for special ed services. So again, the report is saying that we're missing them. So these last two bullets, and again, there was different studies that were cited within the overall overarching report, found significant discrepancy between the incidence and the identification. So one study suggests that fewer than 20% of students with brain injury who need services are actually getting them. The second report that I mentioned here was a survey where they looked at state special ed directors. So these are the people running special ed in states. And according to them, they say that only 40% of students with brain injuries are actually classified under the traumatic brain injury category. And what happens most of the time is that they are misidentified under other categories, such as emotional disturbance, or not identified at all. Okay, so what happens to these kids? So approximately half of the homeless population has sustained a traumatic brain injury. And again, this is low in data. I think it's much greater than half. But that's neither here nor there. The second thing is what I really want to focus on. Of those homeless individuals that are also have traumatic brain injury, 70% experienced their first brain injury prior to becoming homeless. Now let's take a look at that second bullet. Traumatic brain injury in prisons and jails. CDC estimates anywhere between 25 to 87% of inmates report having experienced a head injury or traumatic brain injury, as opposed to 8.5% in the general population. Now, 25 to 87%, that's a wide range. I know that. 25% low end, very conservative, 87% low, but on the higher end. I will tell you that Indiana did a study where they looked at the individuals on their death row. 100% of them had had a documented brain injury. This is what happens to our students with brain injuries more often than not, especially those that do not receive the proper services or interventions, because they fail, because we can't handle these kids, because they end up getting misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. So what can we do, right? So what? This is great, Martin. This is clearly a problem. Okay, fine. What do we do? As the people that interact with students daily, we, the school staff, their teachers, have the most accurate idea of students' strengths and weaknesses. When a student is being considered for an IEP or a 504 plan, we sit there in those meetings and we're just, okay, how are we doing? What, kid talks, all right, yeah, they're responding. To at least bring up the idea of, may a brain injury be causing any of this, okay? Now, again, we're not medical doctors. We don't diagnose. We can't. That's not our job. That's not within our purview of our responsibilities. But if we ask those questions, we make those referrals to people, okay? So if you are aware that there is a potential brain injury, that's worth exploring a little bit further. Like, hey, maybe have you talked to your child's pediatrician about this? I like to put this picture in here, and I use this in presentations over the years of, this to me is what it's like for a kid with a brain injury. This is what day to day is like, okay? They're in this traffic jam. They have no idea where to go. They can't get out of this loop, this circle. They're stuck. What happens? It becomes so overwhelming that they kind of just shut down. So what are different strategies that we can use? There's a gradual return to full activities. Allow for breaks, periods of rest. Provides the student with a quiet place to go. Reduce stimulation. Okay, extended time. Again, these are all things that we do already. I do want to talk about a couple of these things. So first of all, the gradual return and the breaks. If a student is returning to school following a known brain injury, they should not go back to being in school full time immediately. A gradual return, half days. And also, I would even say this, maybe they're only in class for 30 or 45 minutes. And maybe that last 15 minutes, here, take a break, go for a walk, get some rest. Because the healing brain requires so much cognitive energy as it's healing that it's very difficult for the individual to do anything else. So to expect them to sit in a class and do the same work as everybody else or the same type level of work they did prior to their injury is not really realistic or reasonable. Reducing the stimulation. Individuals with traumatic brain injury, especially close to their injury, are prone to headaches and migraines. So, allowing them that the less stimulation, the better, especially with the lights, allowing them to sit next to a window, allowing them those frequent breaks to get up, take those self-timeouts, the extended time. The other thing I really want to talk about is this chunking, okay? I have a student right now, she's got a traumatic brain injury, and it was about 3 weeks ago, she was in our office because we were trying to get her caught up for the end of the third marking period. And there was 4 different teachers in there. And they were all her co-teachers. And each one of them was telling her, do this, you gotta do this, you gotta do this. And in a matter of 30 seconds, and I could have predicted this, I watched the girl shut down, kind of explode, and storm off. So she left and I said, all right, so moving forward, and I looked at her case manager, there should only be one of you interacting with her. Tell her one thing at a time. Check to make sure she understands it. Simplify it. Ask for that follow-up. Because while this was all very good intention and you were all trying to help her, it was too much and we lost her for right now. Now she'll be fine after she gathers herself down and comes back, but you can't throw all that stuff at them because they're going to very quickly shut down. Routine, routine, routine. Now, those strategies on the previous page, that was more for when you know that there was a brain injury. Okay, so well, what about, Art, you talked about how it's the silent epidemic, we don't know what it is. So what do I do then? Okay, these first 2 bullets, this is where they really come into play. Reviewing the student's educational history. Look back, see if there was a cut point, and I do a lot of presentation recently to behavioral health administration, different providers around the state, behavioral health providers, and we always talk about a cut point. Look, when you're exploring, looking at that person's past, was there at some point in time when things changed? So for example, in a student, did it seem like everything was going okay? And then all of a sudden, at what point in time did the student start to fall apart? And let's see, was there something else that happened at the time? Was there a sports injury? Were they in a car accident? What was choking? A choking can be a type of brain injury because again, the brain is without oxygen. That's where it's worth exploring a little bit. And again, going along with asking the student and the family about any prior accidents, falls, etc. Believe it or not, falls are the leading cause of traumatic brain injury in America, and primarily 0 through 4, and then for our senior citizens. The next bullet's again, use of organization, keeping an organized, clutter-free workspace. That's hence the picture of that very nice desk that I've never had my desk look like that. Supports, graphic organizers, set starters, outline. So having structured and routine is so important for an individual with a brain injury. And it's very easy for an individual with a brain injury to very quickly get off task, off topic, lose their train of thought. That's where having those graphic organizers and those outlines can become really, really useful, can really help them keep their thoughts narrowed and focused. A checklist, and again, be flexible. So some key takeaways. No two brain injuries are the same. In the world of brain injury, we have a saying: if you've seen one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury. Recovery is not linear. This is especially true closer to the injury. We used to say that all recovery will take place in the first 2 years. We have recently found that is total BS. That is not true. People are still making significant recovery 30, 40, 50, even 50 years post brain injury. The brain is amazing. The way it can continue to heal itself and recover. So that's fine. Frequent reevaluations, especially closer to the onset of the injury, are critical. So again, as a special educator who was in the classroom for 18 years, I know what a pain that can be, but it's really critical, especially the closer to the injury, because there is so much change that happens during those first 2 years following a brain injury. So I recommend, if there is a known brain injury and it happened, a child returning to school, I recommend reevaluations at least once a year. The severity of the injury is not always the best predictor of long-term effects. So we have categories of brain injuries. We have mild, moderate, or severe. That is only for the length of loss of consciousness. I know individuals who never lost consciousness, who are probably permanently disabled, who have to be live in group homes, supported employment, and all of that. On the other end of the spectrum, I know individuals who were in severe comas, who weren't given much of a chance to live, who have gone in and are now lawyers, doctors, very successful individuals. So that severity scale, mild, moderate, severe, again, is only for loss of consciousness. Do not let that be a predictor at all of anything else. Traumatic brain injury rarely happens in isolation. So why is this important? Because oftentimes what happens, I should say oftentimes, a lot of times what happens is, think about our high schoolers. So there's a car accident, okay? If the car accident, there's a brain injury, but there's also a punctured lung and a broken leg. Chances are that when that child gets to the hospital, the first thing they're going to address is the punctured lung and the broken leg. And they'll say, oh yeah, they had a serious concussion, but it's kind of forgotten about. So when you are exploring or looking at it, or if you find out that a kid was in a serious car accident, the possibility of a traumatic brain injury should go to the top of your radar screen. The other thing is, the signs of a traumatic brain injury may not become apparent immediately. Sometimes it takes 6 months to a year to start showing themselves. And then the last bullet, a concussion is a brain injury. This is really important to realize, to recognize, especially for our athletes. Okay, so a couple of resources. So you have my work email. The Brain Injury Association of Maryland is an excellent clearinghouse. They have a ton of information. The CDC, the link to that report is right there. Project LearnNet, that website has not been updated in a while. There's still some good things on there, but if you want other websites, just reach out to me via email. I can refer you to other resources as well. Lash & Associates is a great company. They produce a lot of things. They produce a great set of tip cards and books on working for students with brain injuries, tips for educators, etc. Thank you. Is there any questions? I see some things in the chat. I will do my best to get, okay, all right. So a couple good points in the chat. So with the slideshow, I will make sure that the folks at EdCamp, I'll make it available to them so that they can get it out to all of you. I'm not sure how to do that myself, but I will make sure it goes to them. Yeah, please.
You can post the link in the chat.
Okay,
your slideshow.
Let me see if I can get to that link real quick. Okay.
So just make it that people can view it.
Okay. All right. Okay, so while I'm trying to figure that out, are there any other questions? I saw a couple other things in the chat that I wanted to kind of address real quick. Let me see. Okay. So has any good study been done on this cell phone on developing brain? So I can tell you that one of the things we recommend as recovery or following traumatic brain injury is reduce screen time. It's also a big common suggestion following concussions too, is cut down on the screen time. You know, again, thinking about just staring at that thing, the optical nerves are very, very intertwined with brain development. So there is that. So the comment right here was most people do not even remember until prompted to recall brain injuries. We tend to deny and forget them. And that is absolutely true. So again, I wish I had the magic bullet, right? I wish I could come up with like some way where there was like if there was a real quick, easy way to test to see if there was a history of a brain injury. Unfortunately, right now, there is not. There's some work with biomarkers and things like that, but that's not really practical for us at this point in time. I will tell you that this is where, though, you know, pediatricians, everything else can be useful. A lot of times, a neuropsychological evaluation is what's done. They are also very expensive. So that's a question of who's going to fund that, pay for it. And again, it's weird because I don't want to say it's weird. It's tough because it's a medical diagnosis, right? And we're the school system. So it's also trying to improve that communication between hospitals, doctors, you know, the urgent cares and the school system, and trying to get us to work together a little better. Okay. All right, so that was a link to hopefully the presentation I just put in the chat. So hopefully you all can get that. Okay. Right, so I really like the suggestion. You could Google Doc with kids to ask specific questions like, have you ever been in a car accident? You know, did you fall off your bike when you were a kid? You know, things like that, things that we don't think about that really are kind of common. So, yeah, and right, you know, some of you are sharing that, you know, you've had different experiences with it, and yeah, you know, poor grades, everything. And again, you know, a traumatic brain injury does not infect your IQ, right? It's like a lot of disabilities, right? You can still be very incredibly intelligent and have a traumatic brain injury, but it's figuring out how can we best deal with it? How can we work through this? So a lot of, I know I crammed a lot of information to a very short session. You guys are fortunate because of technical difficulties. I only had 12 minutes with my first session. So it's a little bit better. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your professional day, and thank you.
Thank you.